Okay.
You are good to go.
Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to try and continue what we were doing last Monday, which was the war known as World War II, our late entry, and then the fighting up until the end when the Germans surrendered. However, the hour was up and we had not talked about the war in the Pacific. So today, we will try and talk about the war in the Pacific. I wanted to, though, conclude the war in Europe so that you understand the nature of that war. Again, 80% of the Wehrmacht, that is the German High Command and all of its forces, were facing the Soviet Union once Operation Barbarossa was set loose. We only faced 20% at Normandy with the British, Canadians, and others. So keep that in mind. The scale is quite different. Also keep in mind that we didn't discuss Stalingrad at all, which is the great battle in the East. Stalingrad, which has finally turned into a great Soviet victory. Stalingrad, which is a great book and a great Soviet film. Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army under General Paulus finally surrendered to the Soviets. The elements of that army were paraded through the streets of Moscow and then put in POW camps. Very few of those Germans ever saw freedom again. Most died in the POW camps. And so it was that that part of the war came to a close. But the war on that end was vicious and cruel. I gave you one German author's view, and I'd give you another book by him. His name is Günter Grass. He wrote the Danzig trilogy, in which you get to meet what they call the Cossacks, the Red Army as it poured into Germany, part of which they totally eliminated. The great German state in the north is Prussia, or was Prussia. It was the desire of Stalin to eliminate Prussia for all time. So the great city of Königsberg is today Kaliningrad. And Kaliningrad had every street name, everything possibly associated with its German past eliminated. All the German citizens were forced to move out, and a totally Russian community was built there. And to this very day, Kaliningrad is part of Russia, even though it is surrounded by Lithuania. This was the great city of the German Enlightenment. This was a city of German philosophy, and it's disappeared. It's gone. And in its place is all that remains called Kaliningrad. The rest was given to Poland and Lithuania. And remember that when I spoke to you before, there was a German chancellor, first from the left, from the SPD, who went to the east of Europe and proclaimed that the Germans were giving up all claim to any of the lost territories in the east. So this certainly meant Prussia. Also, the greatest tank battle of the war was the battle at Kursk between the great Soviet tank, the best tank of World War II, the T-34, and the German Panzers, followed by the German Tigers, the last version. You know, the Germans were rather persistent about staying alive in the war. So you might bond them at a factory, say, near Nuremberg, but they'd come to work the next day, and even though there was no roof on the building, they'd pick up the lathe and what other equipment was on the floor of the factory, and they'd continue to make the parts that were necessary for the German war machine to continue fighting. So it was a very precise way of looking at survival. You fought to the last, in the case of Berlin, to the last child that you could put in the streets of Berlin, fighting the advancing Marshal Zhukov and the Soviet Red Army that did take Berlin. We did not. But enough of the German side. On the Italian side, I did not tell you, and should have, that there were many Italians who were against Mussolini and against the war. And one of them is a highly celebrated writer, Ignazio Saloni, and his great book is Bread and Wine. And I also didn't tell you how the Italians could celebrate even staying alive. As the Fifth Army under General Mark Clark fought its way up the Italian boot, over and above were the American airplanes who were flying, and they did bombing raids, particularly on the industrial cities. And one of the biggest industrial cities of the north of Italy is Milan. And yet in the middle of Milan is the greatest temple to music ever created. It's called La Scala. And performances went on at La Scala even as the bombs were falling on Milan. The building would shake, the soprano would shake, but the singing would go on. It's a very typical Italian story from that part of the world, but we have to leave that part of the world and go across the United States and all the way to the Pacific. There was a growing power in Asia, the power of the Japanese state. This state comes into its own in the late 19th century. First, it was a closed nation. It did not trade with anyone. It did not have, of course, any kind of arrangements. And so it was that under, of all people, a president called Fillmore, we Americans decided to send 4 warships, 4 black dragons, as described by the Japanese who saw them, because they were commanded by Commodore Perry, and they came into Tokyo Harbor. Edo was the name of the city then, not Tokyo. And they forced open the gates. They forced the Japanese to trade with us. And they had warships to do the forcing. Warships that the Japanese referred to as 4 black dragons. When this happened, there was an internal collapse. There was ruling then the Japanese people, the shogun who was in Tokyo and Edo. He was the last of the Tokugawas. And the rebellious young samurai decided his days were limited, and they would bring the Meiji emperor, who was living in seclusion in Kyoto, would bring him to Edo and restore him. It's the Meiji Restoration. Then these very wonderful samurai, the people who could read and write, decided they had to modernize Japan rapidly, having seen what happened to them with the American Commodore Matthew Perry. And so the brightest, youngest were sent off in teams, not to the United States, but to Germany, France, and England to discover and then study engineering, science, and law, and to bring all of that back to modernize Japan. And they did so very successfully in one generation. So that in 1904-05, a clash occurs between the Japanese state and the Imperial Russian government. And the Russians send a fleet. Their biggest and most powerful fleet is located and based at the naval base at Kronstadt, which is in front of St. Petersburg. And so this fleet has to sail all the way around the world to match up against the Japanese fleet. And unbelievably, the Japanese won the great naval battle of the Russo-Japanese War. And we became involved in it because our president, Teddy Roosevelt, was able to settle the peace terms that ended the war. And then the Japanese continued to modernize. They were on the Allied side in World War I. They collected all the German colonies in the Pacific, made them Japanese colonies, and began their move into Northeast Asia. If you think that Japan was closed, you should have seen the Korean Peninsula. It was called the Hermit Kingdom. They talked and said nothing to anyone at all, anytime. We sent one ship to see if we could get a breakthrough. They waited for the ship. It came into a river harbor near Pyongyang. They rowed out to it at night and burnt it down to the water's edge. That was the answer to the Americans. Now the Japanese have taken over Korea. They've then decided to take over a northern slice of China and make it their colony of Manchukuo, and to bring in the last person they could probably find, a little boy, to be the last emperor. It's a very famous film by an Italian communist, Bernardo Bertolucci. That's the only way the Chinese would allow a European in, was they at least had to be a communist, giving it a communist twist. And so it was that Manchukuo became a part of the extensive power growing in Northeast Asia of the Japanese Empire. This began to rile numbers of people in the West as to what ambitions really were there, ambitions for the chrysanthemum throne. Now, in the process, I'll take you back a moment. These samurai were very important people. Since they read and wrote, they were an elite. And they also were a force for good in the following way. The greatest filmmaker Japan has ever produced, his name is Akira Kurosawa. And Kurosawa's great film is The Seven Samurai. And the samurai of the seven were always going forth and helping someone in need, setting them back up, and then moving on. This was such a popular theme. And though we don't think of ourselves as a people of myth, we also took that same film and turned it into an American film called The Magnificent Seven. Wonderful music and a great cast headed by Yul Brynner. And these seven sort of gunslingers decide to do good. They hear a Mexican village is being terrorized. They go down, beat up all the terrorists, throw them out of town, and then they ride off across the horizon. We saw a film like that recently. The film was called Shane. We showed it here as part of our movie committee. And there you have Alan Ladd riding in from nowhere, finding a settler family being harassed, helping the settlers out, once settling the question by killing Jacques Palance. He then rides out of town. Having done good, he goes on to some other mission. It's an old theme, a theme that George Stevens greatly appreciated because he was the director of this film, and he was borrowing it from a great director, one of the world's greatest, Akira Kurosawa, who wrote many films like this, directed them, sometimes wrote and directed, always looking for that other level of understanding of good versus evil. So you have this picture in mind. It seems strange that you're going to have this new kind of Japanese leadership, which is not, in fact, going to address wrongs, but is going to create wrongs. But you get that when there is, in fact, if you want to call it a military coup, the army comes to power in Tokyo, and there is a view of the world different than the view of the old samurais. It's a particularly army view, particularly launched in the personality of General Tojo. So it is with this arrangement of power, there begins to be a diversion in Japanese society initially. There is a Japanese admiral, Admiral Yamamoto. Admiral Yamamoto is well versed in the Japanese historical tradition of the military. He's also served in the United States in the Japanese embassy in Washington. He's also gone up to Harvard and taken a course trying to understand us, these strange people called Americans. And when he's back in Tokyo and he hears the talk of war, he sends out a warning. If you attack the Americans, you will wake a sleeping giant, and perhaps you will lose. Nevertheless, the war comes. Now, as sneaky as we thought it was, there is a theory of war that allows for preemptive attacks. The Israelis have used it once against the Egyptians, where expecting an attack from the enemy, you attack the enemy first without any declarations. And certainly the raid, the strike at Pearl Harbor was preemptive because it was obvious if the Japanese wish to take over South and Southeast Asia, they would come into a clash with us. And so they wanted to damage our sense of power so that we could not carry out any threats. And they were very successful. It was a brilliant operation, Pearl Harbor. There was one great problem, and Yamamoto saw it immediately. He kept asking as the attack was proceeding a very key question: where are the carriers? There should be 4 American aircraft carriers. Where are they? Well, unfortunately, they were at sea. Lucky for the Americans, unlucky for the Japanese. So while they sank our battle fleet, it was minus the famous 4 carriers. You have to think of an aircraft carrier as a floating island that tries to get closer and closer to enemy territory or enemy ships, and then use its aircraft to strike. And so it was that these were still extant. We didn't have much left in the way of a battle fleet, but we did have 4 carriers. And we were soon to use them because there was a battle looming, the Battle of the Coral Sea, which saw the Japanese headed toward Port Moresby and then perhaps on to Australia. And it was a draw. Neither we won nor they won. And then in a few months, there was the Battle of Midway. In the case of Midway, we won, they lost. Now, they had thought this cleverly through when they had to look at the situation facing them. They saw what we never saw, which was we were an unwanted people in Asia. That if they could create a Japanese co-prosperity fear, that then the Indonesians would want to get rid of the Dutch, and the people in Malaya would want to get rid of the British, and the people in French Indochina would want to get rid of the French, and the people in the Philippines would want to get rid of the Americans, and they did want to get rid of us. But we never saw ourselves as the colonial exploiter. So it was we were in the way. And the Japanese made their move. Now they were still on the defensive. You have to realize they brilliantly carried out their plans. Not only had they held Northeast Asia, but within 6 months, they were at the gates of India. They had come down the Chinese coast, had taken everything of importance, Hong Kong, Singapore, moved on, taken Malaysia. Singapore was gone. Singapore had a fortress system just like we have in Manila Bay. It was called the island of Corregidor. It was loaded with huge guns, all facing out to sea. Unfortunately, those clever Japanese refused to sail their big ships in front of our guns so we could blow them out of the water. Instead, they landed up on the Bataan Peninsula, marched down the Bataan Peninsula, and came against us at Corregidor, where they had outflanked our guns. So we had to surrender. They did the same thing. They came down the Malay Peninsula and struck at Singapore from the rear. The guns didn't point in that direction, so Singapore fell. At the same time, to be a part of this effort in the Pacific, the British had sent their newest, best battleship, the Prince of Wales, into these dangerous waters, escorted only by one destroyer. And Japanese warplanes, the famous Zeros, land-based in Malaya, flew out and sunk the Prince of Wales and the escorting destroyer. British sea power gone from the Pacific. Royal colonies, Hong Kong, gone. Singapore, gone. All the way to the gates of India, through Burma. When they got to the Thai border, the Thai said, "You may pass in peace. We will not resist you." So the Japanese army passed through all the way to the gates of India. Prisoner of war camps were jammed. They were badly run, and most of the prisoners died. There's a famous British movie about that called King Rat. And so it was that we were befuddled and befooled. We did have a young man who was about ready to graduate from Berkeley. And he volunteered to lead a group of other crazy young people to fly over Tokyo and bomb it. And it appealed to the spirit of FDR that we had to strike back, and if we could, we would. Spencer Tracy, that wonderful American-Irish actor, plays this crazed guy. The film is called 30 Minutes Over Tokyo. It's a suicide mission. We don't call it that. We don't believe in suicide. But you're to get on the Hornet, which, by the way, is still docked here in Alameda. You can go on it. It's a museum. And they go out into harm's way. They go beyond Hawaiian waters. There is no guarantee that the Hornet will not be sunk. But it pushes as close as it can towards Japan, and then the Americans take off. And they do fly over Tokyo, and they do bomb it. And then they keep flying over the Sea of Japan, and they keep flying over the Korea. You don't want to land in Korea, the Japanese have that. You don't want to land in Manchukuo. You have to land deep in China, where either Chiang Kai-shek's forces or Mao Zedong's forces will rescue you. And lo and behold, a number of Americans make it there. They crash land. They live through the crash landing. They are rescued. They walk all the way across China. They then walk all the way across Tibet. They then cross the highest mountains in the world, the Himalayas, and they come into British India. And they are rescued by the Brits and turned back over to us to fight another day. It's an amazing story, but it wasn't going to build a new world. It wasn't going to rescue the Americans from their dilemma. So it was that we had to think our way through this. Now we had more or less had a draw at the battle we had a win at the Battle of Midway. And now we needed to know what to do. So we divided this largest of all oceans into two parts. On this division, FDR was receiving a lot of help from Admiral King in the White House, who was the chief of naval operations, and from General of the Army's George Catlett Marshall, who was the man that Winston Churchill later called the manager of victory, highly appreciated by Roosevelt. Roosevelt always tried to be very friendly and would say, "George, what do you think of this?" And George would say to him, "Mr. President, I'll call you Mr. President. You call me General Marshall." This is a man who would say to FDR at the beginning of this long, horrible war, both in Europe and Asia, "Mr. President, you know it's possible we could lose these wars." Saying the impossible and the incredible. It is possible that we could lose these wars. We all know today that we won them, but we didn't know that in 1941. So now we've divided the Pacific. The Central Pacific will go to a man who used to be a professor of naval science at UC Berkeley, Chester Nimitz, now Admiral Nimitz, with his staff, Admiral Spruance, Admiral Halsey. But it's the Southwest Pacific that's the problem. It will go to the American Caesar, General of the Army's Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had not been on active service when the war broke out. He had been called back by FDR. He had escaped with his wife in a PT boat from Corregidor right before it fell and made his way as quickly as possible to Australia. When he landed there, he met with the press. He sent to the War Department the speech he was going to give. And in the speech, he said he was going to say, "I shall return." The leadership in the War Department sent the speech back and said, "We think it would be a better idea if you said, 'We shall return.'" MacArthur gave the speech, and as you know, it's quite famous. "I shall return." And so spoke the American Caesar. He had been difficult even in World War I. He became a general in World War I, for heaven's sakes. He was not the youngest man around to command, but he was commanding again. In World War I, he used to shine his boots and then walk on the top of the trench line. No silver bullet could kill him. And it didn't. A very unusual man. Franklin once asked him, "What will you do when you come home when the war is over?" And MacArthur said, "I never think of it. I don't really have a home. My home has been in the military." So now you have a grand debate brewing. We have very ugly battles to fight. You could see right away that it was going to be horrific. The Marine Corps proved that by their landings at Guadalcanal. Let me tell you how fierce the Japanese fought. 10 years after the war was over, Japanese soldiers continued to come out of the jungles around Guadalcanal, not knowing that the war had been lost by Japan, still holding out, eating whatever they could capture, probably a lot of coconuts. That's how loyal this force was to their God Emperor, Hirohito. Nevertheless, if we had to fight everything like Guadalcanal, we would do exactly what the Japanese wanted. They wanted us to come up against a string of islands, one string behind the other string behind the other, and wear ourselves down, because we were famous for not liking long wars, and we would give up. So in Chester Nimitz, we had a fighter. He perceived that the way to victory was to go directly across the Pacific to Tokyo and strike it, and to give up on these costly fights on these islands. The Japanese had just reinforced Rabaul. They had 50,000 troops there. Do you imagine the fight it would take to drive them out? So it was that a meeting was called on an aircraft carrier, ours, in the middle of the Pacific, with everybody who was anybody on board. There was Nimitz and his staff. They welcomed the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, in a wheelchair, finding it very difficult and very painful, had flown from the East Coast to the West Coast and then out to this carrier to be with his commanders. The last aircraft to land had on board General of the Armies, Douglas MacArthur. Now, a proper protocol is for all participants to be on board before the president lands. But it was MacArthur's feeling that he could land last and get the most attention, and he did. He walked across the deck of the carrier. He looked down at Franklin, who's sitting there in his wheelchair, and he said to Franklin, "Good afternoon, Franklin." And the president looked up with that wonderful smile that he had, and he said, "Good afternoon, Douglas." And the Navy knew already that they'd lost part of the battle. But they had great hopes that they could persuade everybody with the briefing they were going to give. So it was that they briefed their plan to go straight across the Pacific into Tokyo Bay and defeat the Japanese quickly. When they finished, it was MacArthur's turn. MacArthur congratulated the Navy. Excellent planning. Wonderful work so far. However, we have in the Philippines thousands of American prisoners of war who are dying terrible deaths, starving to death, maltreated, no medicines, awful conditions. And we simply must rescue them as soon as possible. In fact, the American people would be aghast to know that we had left them there in these terrible conditions and sailed on, leaving them behind with no hope, no charity, no kindness. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was, if anything, a political animal. And he knew that a word of this decision of leaving behind innocent American men, women, and children locked in these horrible places in the Philippines was to occur, it would be a disaster for him politically. So guess what? The decision was to go to the Philippines, to fight that fight first. It turned into a huge naval battle at Leyte. We won, they lost. It turned into the landings. which are another story. Franklin Roosevelt wasn't there for this, but Douglas MacArthur was. And when we had captured enough of a beachhead in the Philippines, Douglas MacArthur waded ashore. And he turned to his aide and he said, "Where are the cameras?" And the aide said, "Well, I'm sorry, sir, but the cameras are back on the ship. They hadn't been offloaded yet." Douglas, wearing his own design uniform, that corncob pipe, which he never lit, stuck in his mouth, those dark glasses, he got back on that landing craft and went back out to sea. And they ordered that the film crew come ashore. When he got word that the film crew was ashore, he then waded ashore a second time. So what you see in the famous film of I Shall Return, and he did return, and he was filmed returning, was in fact rehearsed. It was very much like the American Caesar. He understood the power of photography. What a marvelous vehicle. There are many, many pictures of him taken later flying in an aircraft in profile on the plane, because the most important person on the aircraft apparently was the photographer, the movie photographer. Caesar in his glories. But there were still the Japanese. And on top of the Japanese, there was the trouble with the Chinese. We had created a backwater of this war. It was called the China-Burma-India Theater. We had given command of it to a very feisty American general, Stilwell, Vinegar Joe Stilwell. He didn't want to keep his headquarters in India, China-Burma-India Theater. He wanted to take it into China, all the way to Chongqing, where Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek had taken their government when it fled up the Yangtze beyond the Three Gorges, where the Japanese could not get to them. And sure enough, he got there. He found almost immediately he despised Chiang Kai-shek as a man he thought could never fight, would never fight, was always holding back. Of course he was holding back. He was holding back to fight the communists who were in the north of China, Mao Zedong and the Sixth Route Army. He'd already beat them once in a very famous battle in Shanghai, a battle celebrated by that very famous Frenchman who was there to observe it, André Malraux, a man who wrote then the Condition Humaine, which is translated into English as Man's Fate. It's a brilliant book. And a man who now, still alive in China, makes films sometimes celebrating the end of this period, Zhang Yimou, and for a long time his girlfriend, the gorgeous Chinese actress Gong Li. But this was not to be the heart of the fight against Japan, because everyone began to realize you couldn't fight your way all the way up the way through the Chinese. You had to go by sea, fast, quick, and easy. A side story to this, Chiang Kai-shek was married to a very beautiful woman, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, a disaster walking. She had cancer. It was operable, but she wanted to have it operated on in America. So she flew from Chongqing over the Himalayas to India, and then flew from India all the way to New York City and checked into Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia Presbyterian, was operated on, checked out, went to Penn Station, got on a train, uninvited, showed up at Union Station in Washington, D.C., uninvited, got a cab and went to the White House and rang the doorbell, uninvited, and was met by Eleanor, and Eleanor realized this woman had moved in to stay a while. So Eleanor gave her a bedroom and invited her to dinners. And when they dined with Franklin in his best moods after 2 or 3 martinis, Franklin would tell stories like, "Madam, I am befiddled and troubled by a group of horrible people known as Republicans who are trying to defeat me, trying to throw me out of office. If you had these Republicans in China, what would you do with them?" She had beautiful, long, porcelain-like hands. She would cut their throats. That would be the end of the Republicans. And it dawned on Franklin that he was dealing with a real dictator and his wife in the form of Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. She went back the day she came, flew the Himalayas again, landed in Chongqing again. Chongqing was constantly being bombed. The Japanese could fly up that far and bomb them. They just couldn't get an army past the Three Gorges on the Yangtze River. So that was a quiet zone of the war. It was a very important zone after the war because the Chinese Civil War then really breaks loose. And of course, Mao Zedong wins. Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek and all the treasures from the Forbidden City are then escaping to the island of Taiwan, where they and their remains are now located. So it was that the war had to go on. Now, the war is celebrated in many American novels. Probably the most famous is From Here to Eternity, made into a brilliant film with Montgomery Clift, Burt Lancaster, Deborah Carr and Lancaster in the famous scene where they're making love on the beach. It's the part that everyone watches several times over when you rerun the camera. There was also Norman Mailer's best novel ever, The Naked and the Dead. Many novels. There was little works by James Michener at the end of the war where he wrote a book called, a short story, Tales of the South Pacific. Two guys in New York read it and said, this would make a good Broadway musical. And the musical won the Pulitzer Prize, as did the book, and the Tony Award, and gave Mary Martin a chance to wash that man out of her hair forever, and Itzio Pinza a chance to sing every night just once in a while at the Met. It, of course, the very famous musical and then film, South Pacific. All this was part of the residue of coming out of World War II in the Pacific. We'd already had a number of things like that happen to us that distorted forever the view that we had of the Japanese people. There had been a Frenchman, as there always is a Frenchman, who had traveled to Japan even when it was closed. And he wrote a book about it called Madame Chrysanthemum. There was a producer in New York, David Belasco, and he said, this is going to make a good play. I can turn this into a play from a novel, and we'll call it Madame Chrysanthemum. And it was a hit there in New York, and then he took it to London. It was a hit in London. And then there was this short, noisy Italian in the audience. His name was Puccini. And Puccini said, aha, this play is going to make a great opera. And it did. It made a wonderful opera with a great aria, Un bel dì. It's Madame Butterfly. A problem with these views of outsiders is that they don't always coincide with the reality. Japan is not full of Madame Butterflies. There's no Lieutenant Pinkerton coming to the rescue. During World War II, they were most likely full of Tokyo Rose, who's trying to convince Americans to defect or surrender because we were going to lose for sure. But we didn't go on to lose, but we did have a very strange view of samurais and butterflies. A view that was not going to lead us to victory. What was going to lead us to victory was, in fact, once the Philippines were secured, Nimitz was having his way, and there was going to be a battle up in that direction, the direction being Northeast Asia, centered on Japan. There are going to be some heavy-duty battles, though. While I've never thought much of the directing power of Clint Eastwood, I must say he made two brilliant films about the battles of Iwo Jima. Again, many Marines involved. Again, two sides to the story. And Eastwood directs two films. One is the American experience at Iwo Jima, and the second film is the Japanese experience defending Iwo Jima. Most of the Japanese died. We have a very famous statue right outside of Arlington National Cemetery where the Americans are raising the flag. It's a very heartfelt and emotional thing for many Americans. And it was a bitter and long, but we did win. Then we moved on to an even more ferocious battle, Okinawa. By this time, the Japanese were in fact nearing defeat. But they put up a fierce, fierce struggle for Okinawa. They now called on their pilots to do the unheard of, to use their planes, their Zeros, which were very good planes, as flying bombs. Centuries before, there had been an attempt by Chinese emperors, the Mongol emperors, the Yuan dynasty, to invade Japan. And they had lost because a fierce storm came up. A divine storm, a divine wind, a kamikaze. And so now you would have many divine kamikazes flying against the Americans, destroying their invasion fleet. And so it was that the Americans faced these, and they were very successful in committing aerial suicide by using their airplanes as flying bombs. Okinawa was a bitter, bitter, bitter fight. From cave to cave, from hilltop to hilltop. Enormous casualties. What to do about that? Well, it's been debated for years by American historians what we did do. Nobody knew exactly what we were going to do except a very few. General Grove, who ran the highly secret effort at Alamogordo in New Mexico, and a Berkeley-trained physicist. We were going to build a nuclear bomb, and we did them. We built only two, Little Boy and Big Boy. Strange names. The one we tested actually worked. We put it on a tower, blew the hell out of the tower and the nearby desert and everything within miles. The Berkeley physicist named Oppenheimer, he saw how horrible this new weapon was, and he planned, if possible, to convince the American leadership not to use it against any human targets. He recommended strongly that it be shown as a test device to the Japanese on some deserted place on an island, if necessary, so that they could see that all was lost. This seemed far too complicated, particularly in a Washington that had just discovered that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died at Warm Springs in Georgia, and that there was a new president who was totally unprepared to be president. His name was Harry Truman. And Harry said to his last day he was never sorry that he dropped the bomb, had the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was something that needed to be done. Now, people have debated that for years, particularly a group of scholars, I call them semi-scholars, people of the New Left. Gara Parovitz wrote a book called Atomic Diplomacy. The book argues that we would have never used this against European people. We were only using it against Asian people. Barton Bernstein at Stanford argued it wasn't necessary. We could have gone ashore and there wouldn't have many casualties at all. Where MacArthur's people had said there would be at least 1 million casualties if we tried to invade the home islands. Well, people can argue. The bomb was used. Casualties were awful. There's a wonderful French film about this event, Hiroshima Mon Amour. We have since gone on to build many other, even worse, nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. We can now destroy the world twice over, as can the Russians, as can the French, as can the British. Hooray for humanity. As the war closed in, as the bombs dropped, we dropped so many bombs on Tokyo that there was a greater firestorm in Tokyo than there was over Dresden. And one of our most famous characters, Curtis LeMay, talked of how you could smell as you flew in the bombers close over Tokyo, the human flesh burning below. Finally, the emperor saw the light of day. He asked to go on radio. He accepted the defeat of Japan and the surrender to the Americans, who are basically doing now most of the fighting. And so, at a certain hour and a certain day and a certain month of a certain year, the great battleship USS Missouri came into the harbor at Tokyo, and there, to the chagrin forever of the U.S. Navy, sat General of the Army's Douglas MacArthur to accept the surrender of the Japanese. MacArthur had already made lots of decisions about the occupation. One, no one else was going to be involved. Number two, all the Japanese involved with the prisoner of war camps were to be executed, shot. This is how a Caesar operates. He was going to allow the emperor to live and to rule. He was not to be treated as a war criminal, nor was he to be thrown off of the chrysanthemum throne. He was to rule in a democratic way. He was no longer a god. There was no religious meaning. He was following an American sociologist who'd been asked to write a book about what it would be like to govern war-torn Japan once we won. She wrote a book called Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and she pointed out how important it would be for the success of the occupation to keep Hirohito, and we did. There are pictures of him standing next to 6'5" Doug MacArthur as 5'4" Hirohito, a sort of Mutt and Jeff, but ruling together. MacArthur made his headquarters in the Daiichi Insurance Building, which was still standing, right across from the entrance to the Imperial Palace and the moat. His office is on the 5th floor. The Japanese have a very different attitude towards MacArthur than we do. They think of him as a great hero. They have preserved that office down to every pencil, every inbox, every outbox. The office is exactly as it was when MacArthur was there. I visited it. It's quite impressive. MacArthur's chair is a little higher than any other chair, so if you're invited to sit, he's always higher than you. And he went on to try and govern a war-torn nation that was starving to death. Americans who came to be part of the occupation force were amazed to find people dead in train stations, emaciated. They had no food. We had used the terror weapon that we hated, called the submarines, to sink all the shipping coming into Japan, so Japan had nothing. She was starving. We had to first get food in to feed them. And MacArthur became their shogun, if you wish. To us, he was the American Caesar. There is a book, The American Caesar, the story of MacArthur in Japan. He was a strange and different man. He was born not of the right century or of the right age or of the right people. But he was ours. And he stayed on until the Korean War. He wrote a constitution for the Japanese people. He was determined to see to it that the occupation was a success. He allowed no one else to be part of the occupying power, particularly not the Russians, regardless of what their claims were. They came into the war in the last month of the war. They were nothing to MacArthur. The British, the French, no, thank you. We, Americans, will run the occupation, and we will run occupied Japan. So spoke General of the Armies, Douglas MacArthur. Strange man, but the war was over. And when we meet the next time, you're going to be surprised. We didn't stay at peace very long at all. And the first thing you know, in June of 1950, we were back at war again, this time on the Korean Peninsula. And then 10 years later, we were at war again in French Indochina, Vietnam, Truman's War and Johnson's War. And so we will talk about those wars, what they did to change America for all time. You know that when the war was over in Europe and in Asia, the American soldiers rioted. They demanded immediately that they be let out of the military. They wanted to go home and get into their civilian clothes and into their civilian jobs and get away from this horror called war. And they were real riots. Strange, those Americans. Thank you for coming this afternoon and listening, and I'll see you next Monday at 3 o'clock. 2 more wars in the Pacific, Korea and Vietnam.